All right, welcome back, everybody. So, we are moving into a new chapter and really a new section of the course. So, what we've done so far in chapters kind of 1 through 4 is to review really just some basic economic principles. So, these are the same types of principles that you're going to cover in a Principles of Microeconomics course. So, we talked about optimization, opportunity cost in chapter 3. We applied those ideas to the study of supply and demand in chapter 4. Now, we're going to need those ideas for what we're going to do the rest of the semester, but we're really now transitioning into our study of macroeconomics, which is the study of the aggregate implications of our individual decisions. So we're not going to forget about supply and demand. We're going to apply those, and that'll be very important. But we're going to first take some time in chapter 5 to understand sort of how we measure various parts of the macroeconomy. So in order to understand, for example, how well is the macroeconomy doing, or will we go into a recession, or are we in a recession, we have to understand the definitions of those terms. We have to know what it means for the macroeconomy to be doing well or to not be doing so well. So we're going to focus on a few ideas in measurement, which certainly isn't the most exciting of topics that we have for sure, but you'll gain a number of important skills that you can use in your everyday lives. Adjusting for inflation and some of these basic ideas that we get out of here, you'll be able to apply outside of just this class. So, as per usual, I've got everything kind of broken down by learning objective. And we're just going to start in learning objective 1 with some very basic sort of definitions and understanding of terms. So we're going to define some key macro terms. And before we get into the specifics of business cycles and the different parts of business cycles, I think it's important to think about how far our economy has come in the past 120 years. So if you look at this graph, what I'm plotting is sort of the average income of a person in the US over time. Now, a few things I want to point out, which are things we won't fully understand unless you've seen this before until after this chapter, but it kind of gives us a sense of what we're trying to accomplish. So, first of all, I want you to notice that this graph, the y-axis, is my income per person, and it's stated as in 2009 dollars. So what exactly does that mean? Well, that's a fancy way of saying that we've adjusted for inflation. And so, what does that mean and how do we do it is something we'll accomplish in this section of the course. But what it means for this graph is that all of these incomes take the different prices into account. So in other words, if you were alive in 1900, the average person made about $5,000 per year. And that's really in terms of today's prices. So you can imagine if you made $5,000 per year, how much stuff could you buy? Well, that was the average standard of living of someone alive in 1900. So $5,000 doesn't get you very far, right? So over time, as you can see here, our incomes have increased very quickly. So this particular graph stops in 2015, but if we kept going up to 2020, we're actually right at about $60,000 per year in average income. So we've gone up a huge amount in standards of living over time. And one of the things we want to understand is what caused this growth to increase, and can we expect it to continue going along the way? So the general trend here of our incomes going up over time is what we call economic growth. And the other thing you notice in this graph is that while it's generally speaking going upwards, there are lots of bumps along the road, right? So here's bumps, obviously a big bump in and around the Great Depression, and all along the way the graph is pretty wavy. Those are what we call business cycles, sort of fluctuations around the trend. Over the next several weeks, we're going to try to understand some of the causes of economic growth, some of the causes of business cycles, and eventually try to understand the implications of these two features. Okay, so just a little exercise here, which is really informative in a lot of ways. So there's several skills you'll get from this simple example that can help you evaluate different alternatives in your everyday life. What I'm showing here is the rough growth of incomes over time from, let's say, 1950 to 2020. So 70 years. And our incomes have gone up from $15,000 a year in 1950, adjusted for inflation, right? So that's, imagine what you could buy with $15,000 a year today. That's what the average person had in 1950. So over this 70 years, that amounts to about 2% growth in incomes per year on average. In other words, my income goes up by 2% every year. If that's true, that gets you to basically $60,000 in 2020. So this isn't essential for class, but in case you're wondering, how would I calculate that? Well, if I take my starting income, and I'm going to multiply it by 1.02 to the 70th power, it's the number of years it grows, that gets me to 60,000, or just about approximately 60,000. So that's 2% growth per year. So one thing that we're interested in knowing is, what's life going to look like 70 years from now, right? So what are the lives of your children or grandchildren going to look like compared to what we have today? We're going to keep going on this same increase in standard of living. Well, one of the points I want to make here is that what the exact growth rate is can have a big impact on how much economic growth we see over the next 70 years. So let's just compare where we get, starting at $60,000 in 2020. Okay, so in 70 years, where will we be? So that's going to put us in 2090, if you can believe that, right? So in 2090, what are incomes per person going to look like? So if we have 2% growth, that's going to amount to about $240,000 per year in income. That's adjusting for inflation, right? So it has nothing to do with increases in prices. So imagine what your life would be like today if you made $240,000 a year. You would be pretty well off. That's a very high standard of living. If our economy grows at 2% every year for the next 70 years, that will be the average standard of living. That's pretty impressive, right? But notice, as the growth rate decreases, even by a small amount, sorry, it's not 1.02 there, it's 1.015, 1.5%. That gets you to about 170,000 per year, right? Not bad either way, right? 170,000 per year is a pretty high standard of living. But notice just that 0.5% difference in growth amounts to a very big difference in the incomes in 70 years. That's even more apparent when we go to 1% growth. That gets you to, what, about 120,000 in 70 years. So certainly, if the average person has an income of $120,000 per year, that certainly is an improvement over our standard of living today. But the difference between these two is very big, right? It's double. So if we grow at 1% per year, our incomes are going to go up. But even an extra percent of growth makes a huge difference in how our standard of living has improved. So I want you to keep this in mind when you think about how the economy is doing or where it's going. So this might seem, who cares about economic growth and seeing the Wall Street Journal and this stuff about the GDP went up by this or that. Why do I care about that stuff? Well, how fast GDP goes up per year on average over the next 50 years is going to determine how fast your standard of living is going to increase, right? Are your children, grandchildren going to be that much better off as you are compared to your parents and grandparents, right? That's one of the central questions that we need to think about. And that's something that we will cover in this section of the course. So one last little thing here that I have down, the rule of 70. The rule of 70 is a really handy way to figure out how long it will take for a quantity of money to double. So how long will it take for an amount, doesn't have to be money, of course, any quantity, but in our examples it will be an amount of money or income, an amount of money to double. And it's very simple. So the number of years to double is approximately equal to 70 divided by the growth rate. So for example, if my growth rate is 2%, so let's say I put $10,000 in an investment that makes 2% interest per year. The rule of 70 tells me, take 70 divided by 2, it will take 35 years before I have $20,000, right? So you can kind of see this in play in what we were doing above, right? That rule of thumb helps me a lot. So if I grow at 2%, every 35 years it's going to double. So in 70 years, it's going to quadruple. So $60,000 times 4 gets me to the $240,000. So the rule of 70 works out to be a very handy rule of thumb. In fact, that's what, when I looked at these calculations, that's what I did in my head to arrive at those numbers, right? So if you do the actual calculation, you'll find this is a very good approximation to reality. So it's a really handy rule if you can remember it. Take 70 divided by the growth rate, and you'll know pretty much immediately how big your investment is going to be a number of years into the future. Okay, so long introduction to what we're doing. These are some of the main questions that we're after. The next video, we'll get into some of the finer details.